Project communications. When you're dealing with various stakeholders, when you're dealing with multiple vendors and multiple suppliers, every stakeholder will have different needs of information and what they need communicated to them and how they want to be communicated to. Whilst I was conducting my interview around my first project, I made sure that I made sure to make a note of how they preferred to be communicated to, whether it was Skype calls, whether it was emails, whether it was weekly meetings, whether it was they needed to be communicated face to face, whatever was convenient to them. Also, another sort of a hurdle in communicating to the various stakeholders was location. Some of the stakeholders weren't based on site. Some of the stakeholders were based in remote locations or in locations and in offices that that operate from abroad, or data centers that were placed elsewhere. So you had to put a lot of thought into how you would get information to them that they need. Also considering security, also considering and also considering security of the information that you provide. Most of the information, as I mentioned before, according to CGI policy and in sort of project management in general, information is distributed on a need-to-know basis, and it's very important to highlight beforehand what information goes to what stakeholder and whether it's relevant to them or not. As a part of the first project that I was put on with CGI, I developed a communications management plan that helped the project manager and that helped the team communicate to the various stakeholders and identify their requirements, what the requirements were of what they needed to be communicated, what information needed to be communicated to them, and how they wanted to be communicated to. And this formed the sort of basic schedule of communications and invites to meetings and invites to conference calls and face-to-face meetings, so on and so forth. Yeah, for 1.3, again, as I said, information is distributed on a need-to-know basis. So it's very important to know who the piece of information or correspondence is going to ensure that there's no breach of contract, there's no breach of security, so on and so forth. How you would communicate to suppliers will be a little bit different to how you would communicate to the end user, which is a little bit different to how you would communicate to the client. The various requirements or the various needs of the different stakeholders was identified earlier on. Working on the first project, it was my responsibility to tailor messages to make sure that they were suitable for who they were going to, which meant I had to sometimes summarize what was going on in meetings and distribute back to the stakeholders involved within those meetings. Sometimes that meant creating reports for certain vendors, certain suppliers or clients, and creating reports that went to managers and senior management. So I put together different emails following on from meetings to meet those criteria, to meet those requirements. And I communicated to the various stakeholders in a way that they were comfortable in receiving them. So most of it was conducted through email, but there was a lot of Skype calls because of scattered teams, scattered and remote teams. There was a lot of conference calls as well because of not being able to match schedule. So overall, it was quite important to make sure that the right piece of information was received by the right person. So I communicated through the various mediums that the various stakeholders felt comfortable receiving those informations with, and that was provided by various sort of phone calls, various face-to-face meetings, teleconferences, Skype calls, so on and so forth. One thing that occurred quite a lot working with within different projects within CGI was that there was a lot of blockers. There was a lot of barriers to effective two-way communication. Not all the time was the case that you can have face-to-face meetings, live face-to-face meetings with clients, with difficult stakeholders who were sort of creating some issues within the project, or who were creating some blockages in certain parts or in certain stages of the project. So it was really important to make sure that the communication that was going out to them, whether it was email, whether it was teleconferences, it was precise, it was brief, and it sort of satisfied their needs, their concerns, and got them back on board with the project and with the progress of the project. So one of the biggest issues was the fact that we have various remote teams scattered all over the country, and we've got various different data centers that are in different parts of the UK. So it's not always possible to have live face-to-face meetings sitting down. So a lot of the correspondence, a lot of the communications that went out to them had to be via email, telecommunication, so phone calls and teleconferences and Skype calls and Skype meetings, or even Skype direct messaging. Whenever I would communicate to the various stakeholders, I would always make sure that we are achieving the goal that we are meant to be achieving, and if there's a certain problem, that those problems are highlighted and issues are discussed, and solutions are developed from those issues. If it's just an update, if the correspondence is just for an update, then I always make sure to include all the various information, the background for it, where we're going to go, where we're at right now with the project updates. After developing a communication management plan, I made sure that we as a team stuck to that project management, to that communications management plan, and I made sure that the various team members were sending out those emails and attending those phone calls and telecommunications, as well as assuring that I was a part of the communication that I was supposed to be a part of. The sort of weekly meetings, the bi-weekly senior meetings, and client meetings, monthly update meetings, so on and so forth. However, if there were any issues that arose, if there were any unexpected things that occurred, I made sure that we had some contingencies I made sure that we had some contingencies to convey those messages to the relevant stakeholders. I also factored that in whilst I was developing that communication management plan. There are certain factors that affect people's behaviour, and the most common one is lack of communication. When there's miscommunication, or when there's lag in communication, or there's a lack of communication, there's bound to be conflict because of that. If you are managing people's expectations correctly, and if you're communicating to them correctly and timely, in a timely manner, there shouldn't really be any conflicts in theory. If conflicts do arise, you need to get back to the sort of originating factor of why those conflicts occur. Is it because of lack of communication, or is it because of a change that is in place and people reacting to change in a threatening manner, or whether it's a personal issue? Where people don't get on with various other peoples. With working within the workplace, we work in a sort of multicultural society, we work in a multicultural company, so we come across various different cultures, various different ethnic backgrounds, and people that do things differently. And from that occurs some of the conflicts that do occur, because people have different way of doing different things. But it's quite important to identify the common ground and work on that common ground, and keep the scope in mind to ensure the success of a project. Again, once you've identified those initial factors and behavioural patterns that repeat themselves, it's quite easy to realise what the initial cause of the conflict was, and it's quite easy to manage it from there on. Once you've identified what the issue is, whether it's just basic communication, lag in communication, or lack of communication, then you just need to find out a way to re-engage that person and make them feel a part of the team, make them feel a part of the process. If it's a personal matter, then you do need to engage in dialogue and engage in a little bit more discussion around that to again find some common ground to ensure the success of a project, and not let that be a barrier or not let that be a distraction to what you actually want to achieve. Again, different people need to be communicated in a different way. So whereas some people are very sort of sensitive, they need assurance that you're not going to exploit their emotions, whereas other people are a little bit more fact orientated and very, very rational, and you need to have a very rational approach with them. So you need to adapt your style to match the person, match the situation, and resolve conflict in that particular manner. I've had to come across various different occasions where there was conflict based on lack of communication, based on personal or cultural differences, and again I had to adapt my approach to suit that situation. I had to adapt my communication style. So when you're dealing with a personal issue, you are much more sensitive and much more sensitive about the particular issue that's around, or things that are affecting that particular person. When it's much more work orientated, again you need to get back to the basics, and you need to get back to the factors that sort of seeded that issue in the first place, to go back to basics and sort of stick to the scope of the particular project, or to get back to the basics of a good work environment, a good professional work environment, so on and so forth. I think again, going back to the theme of good and open communications, it's very important to communicate to the people to find out what the issues are and how it can best be resolved, because quite often it's not really your job to resolve those things, where people can often 9 times out of 10 people can often come up with resolutions themselves. You just need to know how to talk to them and how to approach them in a way where they are open to you, and they suggest you what's the best way of resolving that particular conflict. I've had to come across a scenario where 2 of the team members had sort of personal differences, had sort of cultural differences that was getting in the way of them producing the rights, or getting in the way of them working together to produce a piece of work. The way that we had to resolve that was I had to isolate them both and figure out the stories from both ends of what had occurred, what the background was, why there was this sort of tension within the team. And once I've identified that, again I brought them to the common ground, and I showed them that this is just purely because of miscommunication and misunderstanding. There wasn't any real issue that needed to be addressed. It was just a pure miscommunication. Once they understood that, they were able to get on with their job, and they were able to carry on as normal. This is more concerning, in my experience, clients rather than internal conflict within team members. Whereas clients can be unsure of, what the policies are, what the expectations are, especially when it comes down to sort of costing and extra charges. The clients will just, try to stick on all of their requirements and additional requirements that wasn't really agreed beforehand, and would consider that part of the project or part of the package. And once we say that actually what was agreed and what the scope was and what the requirements was at the start is very specific and defined, and we will only produce work to satisfy that, there can be a little bit of confusion, a little bit of conflict that occurs from that confusion. So it's very important to have good project planning, make sure that those plans are communicated to the client, and clear governance from the company also helps improve the planning process of a project and improves communication to the client. If we've got good governance policies within CGI, we're able to communicate that much clearly, and we can communicate our work and our work ethic and the policies and the legalities much effectively to a customer, and reduce conflicts than if there were no governance policies and everything was just ad hoc, and things were just springing up and we had to deal with them as they came. Again, it also reduces downtime. It also reduces distractions, so we can get on with producing the work that is needed to achieve project success. I believe this is something that I've really learned and honed in on being within CGI is prioritizing on what work needs to be done first. What are what's the sort of middle ground, what's the sort of medium priority, and what's like really low. Often it can come across in requirements. So what is the basic requirements that we need to produce a working application with these basic functions, and then things that are desirable but not essential, like graphics, color, they sort of fall second to your sort of first priorities. So it's quite important to prioritize your work to make sure that you're not just working on the things that are desirable, you're working on the essentials and then building up from that. Because at the end of the day, if you've got the desirables produced and not the essentials by the end of the project, or by the end of the estimated project end date, you're going to be in trouble with the client that you haven't produced the work that was necessary, and the work that you've done is not fit for purpose.